I was halfway through installing my new smart lock when I heard the unmistakable clack of heels stomping down my driveway. I didn't even need to look up. That sound could only belong to one person, Cheryl Dawson, the HOA board secretary and full-time neighborhood menace. She crossed her arms like she was about to deliver a sermon. "Eric, what do you think you're doing to your front door?" I glanced at her, then back at the screwdriver in my hand. "Upgrading, it's a smart lock." Totally compliant with the HOA guidelines, by the way. Cheryl raised an eyebrow like I just told her I was building an underground bunker. "Not without prior approval, you're not. Any changes to the exterior must be submitted in writing and approved by the board." I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag. "It's a door lock. It's not a new paint color, it's not a porch extension, it's not even visible unless you're up here trespassing on my property." She stepped closer, ignoring the very real no trespassing sign I installed after her last uninvited inspection. "I'm on HOA business, Eric. I can inspect if I have reason. You don't, and you're not law enforcement, so please get off my property." That hit a nerve. Her lips twitched and she practically hissed, "You'll regret this." I watched her march off like she was storming a castle. 2 hours later, while I was testing the Locks app integration, a police cruiser rolled up. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw Cheryl standing beside it, arms crossed, righteous fury in full bloom. The officer stepped out and adjusted his belt. "Sir, we got a call about a homeowner altering property in violation of HOA rules. The caller said you were installing unauthorized security equipment that might be used to spy on neighbors." I looked at the cop, then at Cheryl. "It's a smart lock, on my own front door." "That's it." He peered at the lock, then back at me. "Do you have any documentation showing it's allowed?" I walked into the house and came back with a printed copy of the HOA's regulation booklet, the one I read front to back after the last time Cheryl tried something shady. I flipped to the relevant section, pointed it out, and handed it to the officer. He read it, nodded, and turned to Cheryl. "Ma'am, it says right here that security upgrades are permitted as long as they don't alter the home's visual design or intrude on other properties. This doesn't violate anything." Cheryl's face flushed like a kettle about to whistle. "He didn't get approval," the officer raised a hand. "It says approval isn't needed for locks, and ma'am, were you on his property earlier today?" "I'm on the HOA board." "I have the right." "You don't have the right to trespass. If he has signage and you were on his property without consent, that's an issue." I pulled up the footage from my doorbell cam on my phone. Cheryl, clear as day, stomping up my steps without even knocking, snooping around like she was casing the place. The officer looked at her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to write this up as a trespassing complaint. You can contest it if you want, but I suggest you leave the enforcement to proper authorities, not personal vendettas." Cheryl opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face turned a dangerous shade of red, but this time she walked off in silence. I waved at the officer. "Thanks for your time." As the cruiser pulled away, I locked my door with the app and just for fun, watched the live feed of Cheryl pacing in her front yard, practically vibrating with rage. She wasn't done. But neither was I. The next morning, I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and glanced across the street. Cheryl's blinds snapped shut like a mousetrap. Ever since the officer filed that trespassing complaint, she'd stopped her usual morning stakeouts. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. I had the feeling she wasn't done trying to assert control over my property. So I did what any rational homeowner would do when living under the watch of a board member with a superiority complex and a grudge. I installed 2 more security cameras. One facing the side yard, the other angled discreetly toward the sidewalk. Not because I expected anything to happen in broad daylight, but because people like Cheryl preferred to work in shadows. Around noon, I heard a knock, a sharp, impatient rhythm. I opened the door to find a tall man in a blazer, clipboard in hand, standing just behind a shorter woman with a pinched expression and a laminated badge clipped to her belt. "Mr. Flanagan?" the man asked. We're with the county zoning and code enforcement office. We received a formal complaint regarding unpermitted construction and possible surveillance violations. I blinked. Surveillance? The woman consulted her clipboard. The complainant alleged that you've installed recording equipment along the sidewalk and are capturing images of private citizens without consent, which may be in violation of state privacy statutes. I stepped back and gestured toward the camera mounted near the porch light. This. It's angled toward my property line. Doesn't record audio, doesn't point inside anyone's house, and it's clearly posted with signage. You're welcome to review the footage. The man nodded. We'll need to take a quick look if you don't mind. I invited them in and pulled up the footage on the smart display in the living room. I showed them the camera views, the timestamps, the storage settings, all standard, legal, and well within reasonable privacy boundaries. The woman watched carefully, tapping her pen against the clipboard like it was a metronome of skepticism. But by the time we were done, both of them had softened. Looks like you're in full compliance, the man said. I'll go ahead and document this as a resolved complaint. I followed them out, and as we stepped onto the porch, Cheryl emerged from her front door with conspicuous timing, holding a cell phone like she was ready to document her next victory. The woman from code enforcement turned to her. Are you the complainant? Cheryl's expression twisted into a mask of concern. I am. I've had several neighbors express discomfort that Mr. Flanagan may be recording them without consent, especially children. I narrowed my eyes. You're manufacturing complaints now, the man interjected. We reviewed the footage. Everything is within legal limits. Posting a camera on your own property with appropriate signage is not a violation. Cheryl's tone sharpened. But he's watching people. The woman shook her head. We're not in the business of enforcing feelings. Unless someone can show us that the camera is obstructing private living spaces or recording private conversations, it's not a matter for our office. Cheryl's jaw clenched, and she turned on her heel without another word. The county officials walked back to their vehicle, and I returned inside, locking the door with a satisfying beep. That evening, I dug deeper. I had a hunch Cheryl was escalating because something else was going on, and I wanted to know what. I pulled up the HOA's most recent financial disclosures, which all homeowners were entitled to request. I'd asked for them weeks ago, but the board had dragged their feet. Now that I had a reason to push, I filed a formal demand under the HOA's own bylaws Section 12, Paragraph 4. All financial records must be provided within 5 business days upon request by a dues-paying member. 3 days later, a packet showed up in my mailbox. Photocopied financial statements, meeting minutes, and a list of approved vendor payments for the past fiscal year. I spent that night going line by line through the documents, and that's when I found it. A payment of nearly $6,000 had been issued to a company called Red Oak Security Services. I'd never heard of them, and they weren't listed as a vendor in any of the previous year's budgets. I looked them up, no business license on file, no address, no reviews. Just a disconnected phone number and a generic website with stock photos and vague promises of community enforcement support. The payment had been signed off by 2 board members, Cheryl Dawson's name right there in black ink, along with the treasurer's. I wasn't sure what community enforcement support meant, but something about it felt rotten. I needed more information. So I reached out to a friend of mine from college, Jasmine, who now worked in the county auditor's office. She agreed to take a look at the vendor and see if there were any flagged irregularities. 2 days later, she called me back. That company doesn't exist, she said. At least not legally. There's no record of it being registered with the state, no tax ID, no filings. But here's the kicker, there was a complaint filed 6 months ago by a homeowner in a neighboring development. Same company name, same circumstances. Their HOA was funneling money to a shell company created by a board member's cousin. My stomach dropped. So this might be fraud. At minimum, it's misappropriation of funds. If that payment came from HOA dues and the vendor isn't real, you're looking at criminal liability, especially if someone forged signatures or falsified invoices. I thanked her and hung up, already formulating a plan. I didn't want to go nuclear unless I had to, but if the board was laundering money through fake companies, every homeowner in the neighborhood deserved to know. That weekend, I walked door to door around the block. I wasn't dramatic about it, just calm, factual. I showed them the line item on the financial statement, explained what I'd found, and gave them a copy of the vendor's non-existent license record. People listened. Some were skeptical at first, but most were tired of Cheryl's power plays and ready for answers. By Monday morning, we had enough signatures to call a special meeting of the HOA board, a right granted in the bylaws if 25% of homeowners requested it. I submitted the petition, copied every board member, and included a certified letter to the management company. Cheryl tried to block it. She claimed the signatures weren't verified. She said the meeting had to be scheduled through official board channels, but she couldn't override the rules. The management company confirmed our petition met the requirements. The meeting was set for Friday at the public library. That night, someone tried to disable one of my cameras. They didn't do a good job. I caught the movement alert at 2:30 in the morning and reviewed the footage. A figure in a hoodie, face mostly obscured, reaching up with a gloved hand. The camera flickered for a second and then resumed recording. I saved the footage and forwarded it to the police. They came out the next morning, reviewed everything, and filed an attempted vandalism report. The officer squinted at the screen. "You recognize the shoes?" I zoomed in. White sneakers with a green stripe. I'd seen those before. On Cheryl's son, Brandon, 19, still living at home and often seen mowing her lawn in that same pair of shoes. "I'm not accusing anyone without proof," I said carefully. "But if you want to follow up on that, you might start next door," the officer nodded. "We'll investigate." By Thursday, word had spread. The neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Rumors flew about the fake vendor, the vandalism, the special meeting. Cheryl went quiet again, and this time she didn't come out onto her porch at all. Her silence wasn't just strategy anymore, it was fear. Something had cracked, and she knew it. Friday evening came fast. The meeting room at the downtown public library had just enough folding chairs for the turnout, easily over 40 homeowners, way more than the usual handful who showed up for HOA functions. The energy in the room was restless. People whispered in corners, brows furrowed, glancing at the front row where Cheryl sat stone-faced, her arms locked like a barricade across her chest. Beside her sat Greg, the HOA treasurer, who looked like he'd aged a decade since I dropped the petition. I took a seat near the front, close enough to read their body language. Cheryl's foot tapped in short, rapid bursts. Greg refused to look at anyone. The HOA president, a quiet man named Bill who usually deferred to Cheryl on everything, stood at the podium and cleared his throat. "We're here tonight due to a petition signed by 37 homeowners, which satisfies the threshold required to call a special meeting. The stated purpose is to address concerns regarding a vendor payment listed in last quarter's financial disclosures." The murmurs turned into a hush. I stood. "That's correct. I'd like to present what I found." Bill nodded reluctantly. "Proceed." I walked to the front, holding a folder in one hand and a printed diagram I'd taped together from the county auditor's database in the other. I didn't need to raise my voice, everyone was already leaning forward. Last month, a payment of nearly $6,000 was made by the HOA to a vendor called Red Oak Security Services. This vendor does not appear in any previous budgets, has no physical address, no business registration, and no tax ID on file with the state. I verified this through the county's business registry and confirmed with a contact at the auditor's office that no such business legally exists. I turned, placing the diagram on the easel. "Here's a list of all registered security service providers in the county. Red Oak is not on it. Not under any spelling variation." Someone in the back raised a hand but didn't wait to be called on. Then where did our dues go? Exactly, I said. That's what we need to find out. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Cheryl didn't move. I also found, I continued, that this same company name was used in another HOA a few neighborhoods over. Same story, fake company, no records, and a sudden one-time payment for community enforcement. In that case, the money trail led to a relative of someone on their board. Gasps spread like a ripple. I pulled out the final piece. And then there's this. I held up a copy of the check authorization form that came with the documents the board had been forced to release. Signed by Greg and Cheryl, no invoice attached, just a memo line that says Community Enforcement Agreement. Bill adjusted his glasses. Cheryl, Greg, would you like to comment? Greg finally spoke, voice dry. It was a short-term contract. We were trying to address security concerns without raising dues. Then why no record of the service? I asked. No logs, no patrols, no reports, and no legal business behind it. Cheryl's voice cut in before Greg could answer. We were under no obligation to disclose every operational detail. Not every vendor has to be licensed if they operate under subcontracted terms. I turned toward her. That's not what the bylaws state. Any vendor receiving over $2,000 must be verified and approved through a competitive bidding process. That never happened. A woman near the front stood up, clutching a copy of the bylaws. He's right. I looked it up myself. And this board never held a vote on that contract. I attend every meeting. The room buzzed again. Another man stood. My wife and I asked about additional security last fall. Cheryl told us there was no budget for it. Then came the final blow. Bill's phone buzzed. He stepped aside, answered, and listened silently for a moment before returning to the microphone. That was the county fraud unit. They've opened a formal investigation into the transaction based on a complaint filed earlier this week. They're requesting all board members involved in authorizing the payment remain available for questioning. Cheryl's face finally cracked. She stood abruptly. You people have no idea the pressure we're under trying to keep this place safe. Someone fired back. You mean trying to keep it under your control? She ignored it and turned to Greg. We need to leave. Now, Greg didn't move. They're going to subpoena the bank records. I'm not going down for this. Cheryl's voice dropped. We handled it cleanly. There's no way they can prove I cut in. Actually, there is. I tapped my phone and mirrored a set of photos onto the library's projector screen. These are screenshots from the bank's publicly available check imaging system. They show the back of the check endorsed by a private account belonging to someone named Warren Dawson. Your nephew. Cheryl's mouth parted, but no sound came out. I wondered why the name Red Oak Security sounded familiar, I said. Turns out Warren registered a domain by that name 2 years ago for a landscaping business that never launched. Then suddenly, it resurfaces as a security company paid by your hand. Bill looked like he might faint. You told me it was a neighborhood watch group. I told you what you needed to hear, Cheryl muttered. A voice from the back called, You lied to all of us. The assistant county prosecutor walked into the room flanked by 2 uniformed officers, Cheryl Dawson, Gregory Niles. We'd like a word. Cheryl backed away instinctively. You can't do this in front of everyone. The prosecutor raised a brow. Actually, we can. Misappropriation of funds, forgery of HOA records, and procurement fraud are all serious crimes, and thanks to the documentation, Mr. Flanagan provided, we have probable cause. Greg nodded toward the officers, resigned. I'll cooperate. Cheryl actually bolted out the side exit, but she didn't get far. One officer was already outside. The door barely swung open before she was intercepted. The room broke into stunned silence. Then, slowly, clapping began. It started with one of the retirees in the 3rd row, then spread like a shockwave. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a steady, relieved rhythm of hands meeting in quiet justice. Bill stepped forward. Until further notice, I'm suspending all board activity. We'll be calling a temporary leadership vote next week, and I'd like to nominate Eric to serve as interim compliance officer. I shook my head. Thanks, but I have no interest in running things. I just want transparency. Bill nodded. Then maybe that's exactly who we need. I left the library with my neighbors, not as the guy who installed a smart lock, but as the one who locked out corruption before it rotted the whole community. And as I passed Cheryl's house on the walk home, I noticed something poetic, the no trespassing sign I'd posted weeks ago. Someone had stuck a post-it note on it. In bold black marker it read, "Guess she should have read this." A week after the library meeting, the neighborhood looked different not physically but in atmosphere. Lawns still gleamed, mailboxes still stood straight, but for the first time in years, people lingered on sidewalks. They talked. They waved. Some even laughed. It was as if the whole place had been holding its breath under Cheryl's grip and had finally exhaled. I spent that Saturday morning organizing the footage and documents into a single, secure drive. I'd already submitted everything to the county prosecutor, but the detective assigned to the case had asked me to preserve the originals in case the court needed to verify timestamps or metadata. At noon, I received a call from Detective Mayers. Straightforward guy, mid-40s, the kind who didn't waste words. We executed a search warrant at the Dawson residence this morning. Found several HOA documents stored in personal filing cabinets, including unsigned checks and meeting minutes that never went public. Also found correspondence between Cheryl and 3 board members from 2 other HOAs in the region. They were planning to expand the same vendor strategy into those neighborhoods. I leaned against the kitchen counter. So it wasn't just our HOA? No, he said. Yours was the pilot run. She called it Community Lane Security Initiative, sounded official enough to pass casual inspection. But the funds went straight into a joint account shared with her nephew. It's wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. She's looking at a minimum of 5 years. I exhaled slowly. And the board, Greg's cutting a deal. He's not innocent, but he's cooperating. The others claim they were kept in the dark. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks for the update. Before he hung up, he added, you might want to keep your security system running. When people like Cheryl fall, they don't always do it quietly. That night, I reviewed the footage one more time just out of habit. Nothing unusual, just joggers, sprinklers, and the occasional delivery truck. No hooded figures, no late-night prowlers. Still, I left the cameras on. Monday brought the emergency HOA meeting to appoint a temporary board. Bill, the former president, had stepped down, said he wanted to spend more time with his grandkids and less time babysitting adult tantrums. No one blamed him. The meeting was held in the community center, this time neutral ground. Folding chairs again, but this time arranged in a circle instead of rows. Symbolic, sure, but it worked. People leaned in. They listened. A woman named Tara volunteered to coordinate the board temporarily. She was a trauma nurse, calm and impossibly organized with no interest in power plays. I backed her nomination, as did most of the room. Later, while people signed the transition documents, one of the longtime residents approached me. His name was Carl, a retired locksmith who lived 2 houses down. Eric, he said, his voice gravelly but kind. I owe you an apology. I voted for Cheryl every year, thought she kept the place in order. I shook his hand. You weren't the only one. She was good at making chaos look like structure, he nodded. You ever think about running for the board? I laughed. I think I've done enough damage, Carl grinned. You did the opposite. As the meeting ended, Tara handed me a sealed envelope. This was in the management company's files. You should see it. I opened it at home. Inside was a letter Cheryl had written to the management company 3 months earlier, requesting permission to change the HOA bylaws specifically to allow board members to approve emergency expenditures without a vote. The request had been denied. But she'd done it anyway. I scanned the letter and forwarded it to Detective Mayers. He responded within an hour. That puts her past the point of plausible deniability. Adds fraud by misrepresentation to the charges. 2 days later, news vans parked outside the courthouse. Cheryl's arraignment was brief but telling. She'd hired a private attorney, expensive, polished, and visibly irritated. The judge denied bail, citing risk of evidence tampering. The courtroom was half full of neighbors. Afterward, I stood outside near the courthouse steps, flanked by a few familiar faces. Greg walked by with his lawyer and paused when he saw me. "I was stupid," he said. "She made it sound like a temporary fix, said it would stabilize the budget." I didn't interrupt. "She told me you'd never catch it, said you were just another guy with a gadget obsession." I raised an eyebrow. "Guess it paid off." Greg nodded and walked away. By Friday, the management company had replaced all HOA keys and access credentials. One of the first things Tara did as acting board chair was implement a third-party auditing policy quarterly, with homeowner access to the results. The subdivision newsletter changed tone. Gone were the scolding reminders about trash can placement and lawn height. Instead, it highlighted a new community garden project and invited residents to vote on how to use excess budget funds that had previously disappeared into vague, miscellaneous enforcement categories. One homeowner, a single mom named Vanessa, suggested building a small playground in the cul-de-sac where she lived. Another proposed a quarterly block party. No one shot them down. A month later, the cameras captured something I hadn't expected. Brandon, Cheryl's son, walking up my driveway. He didn't ring the bell, just left an envelope with a note inside. It wasn't long, just 5 sentences. He apologized for trying to disable the camera. Said he'd been angry and embarrassed and that he didn't know what his mom had been doing with the HOA funds. Said he'd started working full-time and was trying to fix things. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because sometimes silence is the cleanest closure. The cameras stayed up. Not because I was afraid, but because they had become something else, proof that transparency, once installed, didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be there. The subdivision eventually voted to rename the HOA. No one wanted Chestnut Ridge Association anymore. It became Chestnut Commons, a nod to shared responsibility. The new bylaws capped board terms, limited discretionary spending, and required full disclosure of all contracts. The smart lock, still on my door, still working flawlessly. And every time I use it, I remember the day I installed it, how a simple upgrade nearly spiraled into a legal war, and how that war unearthed something far worse. Cheryl had called the police on me. In the end, they took her away.